Welcome to this week's edition of Flashback Friday, your opportunity to get some good review by listening to episodes from the past that Jason has handpicked to help you today in the present and propel you into the future. Enjoy.
Speakers, publishers, consultants, coaches, and info marketers unite. The Speaking of Wealth Show is your roadmap to success and significance. Learn the latest tools, technologies, and tactics to get more bookings, sell more products, and attract more clients. If you're looking to increase your direct response sales, create a big-time personal brand, and become the go-to guru, the Speaking of Wealth Show is for you. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
It's my pleasure to welcome Shane Snow to the show. He is co-founder and chief creative officer of Contently and author of Smartcuts, How Hackers, Innovators, and Icons Accelerate Success. And I really enjoyed that book. I just finished it maybe a month ago. And pleasure to have Shane on the show today. Shane, welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's my pleasure. And thank you for reading.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you. And, it's such a great concept. A lot of people are talking about hacking. A lot of people are talking about biohacking nowadays and just hacking their way to success. In the old days, they would have called it cheating. Mm-hmm. But why really does it need to take 10 extra years to do anything, right? If you can just figure out the secrets and get there quicker, that's the way to go, isn't it?
Well, that's the thing that I wanted to explore as I wrote this book is how do people throughout history who beat expectations do it? What are the patterns? And the hacker as a term, right, has sort of evolved in popular lexicon from this sort of MacGyver concept of finding a smarter path or smarter way to do something into criminal activity, and now back to, sort of life hacking and like you said, biohacking or growth hacking. The idea is that the conventional way of doing things or the way that everyone else is working is by definition average. And if you can find a smarter way of doing things, often it's unconventional, but that can get you to success faster. And with what I was looking at is not shortcuts where you're taking value away or, I always say that buildings fall down when architects take shortcuts, but smarter ways of doing things that provide more value, but just get you there quicker.
Well, that's certainly true and certainly a good point. So in the book, I remember you starting off with the gaming and Super Mario Brothers, I believe. Mm-hmm. Give us some examples of some of these great hacks by great innovators.
One of my favorites is when there's a children's hospital. I read about this in the book. A children's hospital in England that was having this problem of kids were dying in the recovery room and they couldn't figure out how to stop this problem. It was because they would operate on a child, do a heart surgery, then they'd move them to another bed, run them down the hallway, and then move them to another bed and plug in all this stuff again in intensive care unit. And there were all these problems that were happening in those transfers where they just try as they could. Information was being lost, there were technical errors. And what they tried doing is what most of us would try doing. They looked at best practices of what do other hospitals do to successfully do these handoffs between, the different rooms and get these kids to recover well. And they couldn't make improvement. They made very small improvement until they looked, a couple of doctors sat down one day and turned on the television and saw the Ferrari team for the Formula One do a car, basically pit stop very, very quickly. And they realized that a bunch of guys huddled around a car, tearing off tires and refueling it in a few seconds was very similar to a bunch of doctors huddling around an operating table, pulling off ventilators and attaching monitors and tubes and things. And so they invited themselves down to Italy to learn from the Ferrari drivers, the Ferrari pit crew, on how do they do this complex process very quickly and safely. Then they brought the pit crew team up to London to help them re-choreograph their routine. And they were able to reduce the number of errors at this hospital by something like 50% overnight. And basically the smart cut there, the hack was don't learn from your peers that are so ingrained in the way things are done in your industry that if you want to make breakthrough change, often you have to look outside your industry, take a sideways step, look for inspiration in other places. And you actually see that same pattern over and over and over again. So it's this idea of we hit the creative plateau, or either we're solving problems or we have metaphorical writer's block, rather than just looking at the people that you aspire to be. look at people outside your field, and you'll come up with ideas that will help you surpass those people that you aspire to be.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And that Pitstop concept is such a good one. I remember years ago, I suggested that idea to a friend of mine who owned a car wash. And I never really understood. Now I've seen a few more car washes doing it this seemingly, to me, smarter way. Why is it that it's the same amount of man hours, if you will, right? If one guy is going to vacuum and then they're going to send the car through the machine and then it's going to come out the other end, the other guy's going to, do the windows and wipe off the dashboard and all that kind of stuff and wipe down the console on the inside. Why is it that you just can't have all that done on the backside of the car wash after it comes out of the machine and have, 2 or 3 people, as long as they're not tripping over each other? The pit crew concept makes a lot more sense. It just completely makes sense. And she implemented that, and it seems to be working great.
That's great.
For her car wash, yeah.
Well, when you ask why not, the reason that usually people give is because that's not how it's done. And that is sort of the enemy of innovation, and certainly the enemy of breakthrough progress, right? This is the way it's done very rarely gets you to the point where you're so much better than your competitors that you win their business, or that you are making so much improvement that you take your business to another level. That doesn't happen if you stick to the safe thing, right? And that's the thing that people worry about, is it's risky to do things differently, but it can be a much higher reward if you do things differently in a smart way, not just to be different, but a smarter way.
Yeah, so no question about that, Shane. So in the book, you divide it into these 3 parts. One is shortening, leverage, and then soar. Tell us about those 3 parts, if you would.
What I looked for I went through kind of a tour of the history of business and arts and science, and I looked for breakthroughs, and I looked for kind of these overachievers that managed to do things in incredibly fast amounts of time, and basically try to do a regression analysis. What are the patterns in the way of thinking that these people throughout history have done? And there's a lot of contemporaries and some from a long time ago. And overall, there are sort of 3 main types of hacks or Smartcuts. And the first is finding a shorter path, or making the number of steps between you and success fewer. The second one is amplifying the effort that you're already making. So leverage. So the idea of using a lever to lift up a heavy object requires a lot less muscle power. It's a smarter way of doing things. And then soar is this idea of doing things, adding, I guess, radical constraints or radical expectations in order to do things at a world-class level. So kind of once you've engineered a smarter path, once you've maximized the bang you get for your buck, then how do you take things to another level? And really, those are just kind of the themes. The chapters themselves are about individual either myths around success or common pieces of advice around accelerating success, and sort of a little bit of mythbusters between research and stories, where when we're talking about shortening, talking about common success advice around paying dues or finding mentors, or lean startup, fail fast, fail often, and explore how to exploit those ideas in order to make the path to whatever you're trying to do shorter. In the second part with leverage, I talk about leveraging platforms for how do you use technology, how do you approach using technology or sort of technology alternatives to not reinvent the wheel. How do you ride waves and use pattern recognition to basically let markets push you? What's the smarter way to use networking and connecting with humans to accelerate your success? So, the idea is you can make 1,000 friends, or you can make friends with the person with 1,000 people that trust them. The second is a lot faster, and it can be a lot more effective. But how do you do that? What are sort of the secrets of these overachievers through history in leveraging networks of people? And it kind of goes against the common advice of, the common advice is it's not what you know, it's who you know. But normally when you talk about networking, you're handing out business cards at events and being persuasive and learning how to sell people. The smarter way of doing that is flipping that on its head and figuring out how to give to people. And then the question is, how do you give to the people that have everything, that have the biggest networks, and so on? So those are the kinds of questions that I address through those. And then in SOAR, I'm talking about how world-class successes that manage to get to where they are very quickly, but keep sustained success and keep growing, how they use momentum, this idea that momentum is a better predictor of success than anything else, and is incredible at getting people to come join your cause. And I talk about radical simplification and how, Apple and Picasso and these great innovators make things simpler and how that can take you to a new level. And then I talk about 10x thinking, which is really around this idea of if you shoot so high that you have to break everything about your business or your plan, it forces you to step outside of the conventional path. And this is what amateur rocket scientists and world-class, successes in various fields and places like Google, how they think. They don't think, let's make incremental progress. They say, what if we had to do it 10 times better? What do we have to change? And so those are kind of the ways I break up the book, but it's all around these patterns of different ways of thinking about problems. By the end, it becomes this sort of almost a checklist of things that you can say, if I were to apply, this principle to this problem, what would I have to do?
Yeah, no question. So I remember the example in the book of make 1,000 friends or just friend someone with 1,000 friends. In other words, for entrepreneurs, for anybody who's got a message to get out or anywhere, so virtually everybody nowadays is a publisher of some sort, I want to say, because, we all want influence, and at the most personal level that's done on social media and in-person interactions. But, everybody does a speech occasionally or gets in front of a group. And, you're really just leveraging someone else's network, someone else's audience. So maybe two keys that you did allude to there are, to answer the question for us, if you would, Shane, how does one do that? How do they, become important to that influencer so that they can, leverage that person's audience? And how do they get mentors? Everybody wants to have a good mentor, of course. Saying, hey, will you be my mentor is definitely not the way to approach it.
Right.
Because you're not offering anything. That sounds like it's just a demand on my time. And, who has time nowadays, right? Right. What are some of those techniques if you drill down on them?
Yeah. So the question that I asked when I started exploring this, I talked to, networking gurus and people who'd been listed as, the best networkers in, America and those types of folks. And I also explored, a lot of networking theory and some really good academic research about success based on your connections and networks. And, the old school advice was that, sell yourself, hand out your business card, ask people to be your mentor. The problem is, and the question that I asked everyone is, say I wanted to get to Richard Branson. I wanted him to help me out somehow or to connect me to his, millions of people that follow him and trust him. What do I got to do? And the first answer that you get is you should probably rethink whether Richard Branson is the ideal person to help you. Because first of all, he's very busy, but he may be at a level where he's not accelerating as much as maybe you want the person that's kind of underneath him. So that's the first question, is just rethinking, is that person that you're targeting really the right person? But say it is, then what does a billionaire like Richard Branson need, right? He can buy anything he wants. The better question is, what does he care about? And even better is, who does he care about? The best way to get the attention and eventually the help and sort of the network of someone with a big network or who is important or in demand is to help the people that they care about or help them help the people that they care about. So everyone like Richard Branson has a charity or causes that they care about, but they also have an audience. One of the best ways to what I call super connect is to give these people content or information or material that can help their audience. So a real life example for me is Tim Ferriss, the author of The 4-Hour Workweek. He, has this massive audience, a lot of people who read books like mine, and he's known for being this guy that sells books. So long before I wrote my book, I really wanted to connect with Tim. He's in the universe of people that I would love to have, kind of on my side. But you can't just email this guy and say, hey, would you promote my stuff? Or, hey, let's be friends, because he's really busy and in demand. So the way I became friends with Tim is I emailed him with a story idea for his blog. And I said, basically, I had this great story that I was going to write for Wired magazine, where I normally write. But instead I went to Tim and I said, hey, I have this great story idea that I think your audience is going to appreciate. And it ended up being something that was a good fit for his audience. And what he's concerned about at his level is feeding the people that are his fans with stuff that can keep them around as his fans and keep that relationship alive. So I help him build his relationship and maintain his relationship with his fans by giving him material to feed his fans. And in this case, it was in the form of a guest article. And I did this for him, and it can't be self-serving. It has to be helpful, right? And I did this for him a few times. And this is how I developed a relationship with Tim, by helping the people he cared about. And so at the point when my book was coming out, he was more than happy to take a look or let me, again, guest post an excerpt from my book so that I could expose his audience to what I was writing about. In every case, there was never an ask that was like, hey, promote this thing, help me make money. It was always around this idea of let me help your audience and therefore you. And that's how we built a relationship. So I think that's the strategy. And when you look at the academic research about people who are successful in networking, the people who get the furthest are the ones who are givers. There's this great book by Adam Grant, who's a professor at Wharton, called Give and Take. It's all about the research around people who are givers getting further, and whether it's in networking or in their fields. The better strategy, rather than asking and selling, is to provide value. And if the person has $1 billion, provide value for the people that they're trying to help. And that's the better way to make connections. And when you talk about to any of these networking gurus now, these super connectors, the first thing that they say is that their job is to help other people first, knowing that builds up karma and a fan base and allows them to create a community around themselves that can then help them. And so that's kind of the strategy that ends up happening. In the book, I talk about how the Cuban Revolution was won so quickly through this idea of using the radio and then helping people learn how to do their jobs and everything better, rather than trying to convince them to pick up arms and fight the government.
Right. I remember you talking about Che Guevara. I wish people didn't worship that guy, though.
Right?
He wasn't a good guy. You know, every time I see someone wearing one of those stupid T-shirts, I want to go and say, do you realize what this guy did? I mean, Castro wasn't good either.
Oh, yeah.
But,
the hot topic generation has certainly taken that guy. But, the point of is even, and that's one of the things that I wanted to explore in the book, is good guys and bad guys.
They use these techniques.
Exactly. Yeah. And hopefully we can use them for good.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that really kind of answered the getting the mentor question as well. And it's a good example about Tim Ferriss and Richard Branson. I was going to say, I had the good fortune to go to Necker Island and hang out with him once. You could just give $25,000 to $40,000 to Virgin Unite and go to Necker Island and hang out with him too. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of an expensive way to go.
Sure.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so what other like hot techniques do you want to mention? You've got those three sort of major parts, then you've got three subcategories in each. And I just thought I'd leave it open to you, to whatever you think is important.
I've been doing a lot of corporate speaking lately, and the things that have resonated a lot with businesses in the speaking that I've done have been kind of around this idea of what are the questions that you can ask yourself to spur this lateral thinking, right? This hacker thinking. How do you train yourself to think of things that you wouldn't normally think of, right? It's sort of a circular question. And the three things that kind of emerge as themes out of the book come from, the first chapter and a couple of the last chapters, but it ends up being an overarching theme. This idea of seeking sideways inspiration that I talked about, with the race car drivers and the Docksters, or taking sideways moves. When you hit the ceiling or you hit the plateau, look sideways, see where you can sort of pivot, so to speak. Or asking yourself, how would someone in another who's very unlike me handle this? How would a ballet dancer approach this problem? How would a fireman approach this problem? How would X company that's not in our space approach this problem? That's the first one, that sideways thinking. The second one is this idea of radical constraints. One of my favorite questions to ask when you're building a product or when you're working on a problem is, what if we had to do this for 100 times cheaper? When you ask that question, it forces you to really think about what's basically to really think about what's good and what's essential. And
right. And that's a great part of like the lean startup methodology. Exactly. I love that, because you saw in the last .com bubble, 1999, 2000, 2001, that era, all these .com companies having money just thrown at them by VCs, and it ruined them. Mm-hmm. It's kind of counterintuitive that having a lot of money could be bad, but it really can, right?
Right. Well, having fewer resources forces you to be more creative is really what it comes down to. And that creativity is what gets companies to be a step function better than their competitors. If you have money to do everything, you're going to do everything, and you're actually going to end up sort of regressing towards the mean. You're going to copy everyone and try and do what they're doing a little bit better using your money. But then, this is why you see small companies all the time disrupting huge companies, because they don't have the resources or the luxury to do things the way it's supposed to be done. So they have to do things in a hackery kind of way. And the reason I like the question of 100 times cheaper is that's so dramatically cheaper that you can't just make things more efficient. You can't just optimize. You have to rethink. So that's one of my favorite questions. The other question that I alluded to earlier is this question of asking yourself, what if we had to do this 10 times better? Not just 10% better, but 10 times better. And that it's a different angle at that same goal, which is breaking the assumptions, breaking the norms or the conventions of the way things are normally done, or even in your business or in your industry. Because in order to get 10 times better, you can't just optimize or make things more efficient or cut costs. You have to rethink, the fundamentals of the way things are done. And so we actually have this thing that we do at Contently at my company every once in a while, where we'll sit down and we'll take some aspect of our business and we'll ask that question: what if this had to be 10 times better? And then we'll define, well, what does better mean, in this case? But then the discussion leads to, what would we have to break? What would we have to get rid of? Who would we have to fire? Who would we have to hire? What would we have to spend? What would we have to do? How would we have to re-engineer our way or reorient ourselves, around this problem in order to get to 10x? And some of the stories that I ended up, finding for the book, the main story is the story of SpaceX, the space company that.
Sure. Yeah. Peter DeMontes and so forth, and the X Prize that sort of launched that whole revolution, really.
Yeah. And how do you get to space is a really hard problem, but part of what allowed SpaceX to become the first private space company to get there and to do all the incredible work that they've done is their goal wasn't reducing the cost of getting to space. Their goal was to put life on Mars, to put the human race on Mars, which is so big that you have to really, really, really rethink the entire process of getting to space. So those are my three questions. How can you think sideways? What if we had to do something that was a step removed, to the side of what we're doing? What if we had to do this 100 times cheaper? What if we had to do this 10 times better? Those questions are probably the best framework for brainstorming, for problem solving, or making your business better that I can think of.
I think that's definitely a great idea to really look at the whole fundamental context. I mean, back in the days before the automobile, were people saying, well, how can we get a faster horse? How can we get them to go faster?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
It's just not the right question. You got to ask a whole different question.
And it's funny that we still use the word horsepower, right? That's like a idea.
That is, yeah. It's very funny. Yeah, very funny. Very interesting. Shane, give out your websites and tell people where they can find, both your company and then your author site, if you would.
So my company is contently.com. It's, we help brands become publishers, and we do a lot of education for content marketing, which I think a lot of the audience here is probably thinking about because it's the big buzzword. So contently.com. And then all of my stuff is just my name, shanesnow.com. You can find links to the book and all of my writing and everything there.
Fantastic. So in terms of a startup business, so it's everybody's walking around with a business idea in their head. Maybe they have their own business now. Maybe they have a corporate job and they're working in a cubicle and they hate it. And they want to try doing something on their own. Mm-hmm. Any more advice that you can give someone who wants to do a startup, someone who wants to become an entrepreneur and get out there and we talked about thinking differently from a different context. That's all great, but just any other thoughts on that for you?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is that if you want to do that, but you're unsure how, or you're nervous about it, the best thing you can do is to join a startup. Become an early employee, even if you're underpaid, at a company that is really fighting the uphill battle as a startup, and you will learn so much in a year versus kind of any other education you can get. This is part of what inspired me to do a startup is, I wrote about startups and that inspired me, but back when I was in college, I interned at a startup, and that was when it clicked for me that, and you learn all of the things, you see everything really raw and up close. that's when it clicked for me that I wanted to do this. And also you learn a lot of lessons from that. So that's the first thing is if you're not quite there yet, join a startup, quit your big job and join something small and scary and then start your own thing. The other thing too is too many, and this might be common advice, but too many people wait on the idea or they talk about the ideas that they have or they're nervous about it and they don't take the plunge. I think one of the best things you can do is jump in with both feet. Save up a little bit of money, or I guess I shouldn't advocate getting credit cards out, but jump in on the thing that you're doing. Build the thing that you want to build. And if you're cash constrained, then that constraint actually could be really great. Like we've talked about, create the thing that you want to create rather than sitting around planning or talking about it or sort of looking for someone to help you build it. That's the biggest thing. And that's the pattern with any of these people that, that I write about even, is that they are doers, not just, there's certainly the smart work, but there's also the hard work of getting out there and actually jumping in. So, like I said, it's common advice, but it's really the thing that makes the difference between people that make things happen and don't, is people that make things happen. They just jump into it.
Yeah, no question about it. I like to say, cultivate rational recklessness.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
You got to be just a little bit reckless, not too much, obviously. That's not prudent, but you got to just kind of go for things. I mean, the history books are replete with examples of people who did crazy things that worked out, and nothing ventured, nothing gained, as the old saying goes, right?
Wear a helmet, but get on the bike.
Good way to put it. Good way to put it. Shane Snow, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jason.
This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company, all rights reserved. For distribution or publication rights and media interviews, please visit www.hartmanmedia.com or email media@hartmanmedia.com. Nothing on this show should be considered specific personal or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own, and the host is acting on behalf of Platinum Properties Investor Network, Inc. exclusively.